Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight we are going to talk about something unusual for this channel, because the subject of tonight's story is not a person, and it is not exactly a nation, and it is not quite an empire in the way that the word usually means. Tonight's story is about a company. Several companies actually, but primarily one, a joint stock trading corporation chartered by the English crown in the year 1600, with an initial capital subscribed by a group of London merchants whose original and entirely modest purpose was to break into the spice trade of the Indian Ocean and bring home a profit for its shareholders. Over the following 2.5 centuries, this company would raise its own armies, larger than the standing armies of most European states. It would fight wars, negotiate treaties, mint its own currency, run its own courts, collect taxes from tens of millions of people, and eventually govern, directly or indirectly, the entire Indian subcontinent, one of the most populous and historically significant regions on Earth, not as the instrument of the British government, but as a private corporation answerable, in the first instance, to its shareholders in London. It is, by any reasonable measure, the strangest and most consequential commercial enterprise in human history. And tonight we're going to tell its story, alongside the story of its great rival, the Dutch East India Company, whose own version of this same improbable transformation reshaped the islands of Southeast Asia with a thoroughness and a brutality that has its own claim to historical significance. This is a story about spices, and then about cotton, and then about opium. It is a story about how a trading relationship can become, through a long accumulation of small decisions each individually justifiable, something that none of the people who made those decisions ever explicitly intended, the direct territorial rule of one civilization over another, conducted through the offices of a corporation whose primary legal obligation was to generate returns for the people who had bought its shares. It is a story about the specific moment when private commercial power and state military power became almost impossible to distinguish from each other, and about what happened to the millions of people who lived under that arrangement, and about how, eventually, the arrangement became so monstrous, so unaccountable, and so embarrassing that even the governments that had benefited from it for 2 centuries decided it had to end. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the room go soft. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the very end of the 16th century, to a world in which the most valuable commodities on Earth were grown on a handful of small volcanic islands that almost no European had ever seen, and to the merchants of London and Amsterdam who decided they wanted a share of what those islands produced. To understand why the East India Companies came to exist at all, you have to understand the spice trade. And to understand the spice trade, you have to set aside almost everything that the word spice suggests to a modern person standing in front of a supermarket shelf. In the late 16th century, spices, pepper above all, but also cloves, nutmeg, mace and cinnamon, were not a minor culinary luxury. They were among the most valuable commodities in the entire world economy, commanding prices in European markets that were many multiples of their cost of production in the places where they actually grew, and the trade routes that carried them from their points of origin to the tables of European aristocrats had been for centuries one of the great arteries of global commerce. The reasons for this value were several. Spices were used to preserve and flavour food in a world without refrigeration, certainly, but their value went well beyond the practical. They were markers of status, consumed conspicuously by those who could afford them as a demonstration of wealth and access to the wider world. They were used medicinally, in the elaborate humoral medical systems that dominated European thought, where the hot, dry properties attributed to pepper or the specific virtues attributed to nutmeg were genuinely believed to have therapeutic value. And they were, perhaps most importantly for our story, geographically concentrated to an extraordinary degree. Black pepper grew primarily along the Malabar coast of southwestern India. Cloves grew in the entire world on a small handful of tiny volcanic islands in the Maluku archipelago of what is now eastern Indonesia, the Banda Islands and a few neighbouring islets, an area you could walk across in an afternoon. Nutmeg and its associated spice mace came from an even smaller cluster of islands within that same small archipelago. Cinnamon came primarily from Ceylon, the island now called Sri Lanka. This concentration meant that whoever controlled the points of production, or even just the choke points through which the spices had to pass on their way to market, controlled an enormously profitable trade. For centuries, that control had rested with a long chain of intermediaries, Indian and Southeast Asian traders who grew and gathered the spices and sold them to Arab and Gujarati merchants, who carried them across the Indian Ocean to ports on the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea, where they were sold again to merchants who carried them overland or up the Red Sea to Egypt, where Venetian merchants bought them and shipped them across the Mediterranean to distribute throughout Europe. Every link in this chain took its profit, and by the time a sack of pepper reached a market in Antwerp or London, its price had been marked up by a factor that, depending on the specific commodity and the specific year, could run into the thousands of % over what the original grower had received. The Portuguese had been the first European power to attempt to cut out this chain of intermediaries entirely, sailing around the southern tip of Africa in the 1490s, Vasco da Gama's voyage of 1497 to 1499 being the foundational event, and establishing a network of fortified trading posts along the coasts of East Africa, the Persian Gulf, India, and eventually Southeast Asia, through which they attempted to monopolize the spice trade by force. The Portuguese Estado da India, as this network of posts and the trade it controlled was called, was a remarkable achievement for a kingdom of Portugal's modest size and population, but by the end of the 16th century it was showing signs of strain, overextended, underfunded, and increasingly vulnerable to challenge from the rising maritime powers of Northern Europe, who had watched the Portuguese profits from the spice trade for nearly a century, with an envy that the specific political and religious circumstances of the 1590s were about to convert into action. The specific circumstances were these. In 1580, the Portuguese crown had passed through a dynastic inheritance to the King of Spain, Philip II. The same Philip II whose armada we have discussed on this channel, and whose ambitions and frustrations shaped so much of the late 16th century Atlantic and European world. The union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns meant that Portugal's overseas empire, including its Asian trading network, was now nominally under Spanish control, and Spain was, by the 1590s, at war with both England and the rebellious Dutch provinces. Philip's response to this situation included closing the port of Lisbon, which had previously been the European distribution point for Asian spices, including for Dutch and English merchants who purchased them there for redistribution, to ships from enemy nations. This was, from the Dutch and English perspectives, both an economic catastrophe and an opportunity. The catastrophe was the loss of access to a trade that had been enormously profitable even at the redistribution stage. The opportunity was that if you could no longer buy spices in Lisbon, the obvious alternative was to sail to Asia yourself and buy them at the source, cutting out not merely the various intermediaries of the old overland and Red Sea routes, but the Portuguese themselves, who had spent a century establishing exactly the kind of direct access to the spice-producing regions that Dutch and English merchants now found themselves needing. The Dutch moved first and moved with extraordinary speed and energy. The first Dutch expedition to the East Indies, led by Cornelis de Houtman, departed in 1595 and returned in 1597, having made contact with the spice-producing regions of the Indonesian archipelago, and having demonstrated, despite a voyage marked by disease, conflict with local rulers, and the loss of more than half its crew, that the journey was possible, and that the profits, if the difficulties could be managed, were enormous. Within a few years, a flood of competing Dutch expeditions and trading companies had been organised, each raising its own capital, each competing with the others for access to the same limited markets, driving up the prices that Dutch merchants paid to Asian suppliers and driving down the prices at which competing Dutch companies could sell to each other in European markets. A competitive frenzy that the more far-sighted of the Dutch merchant elite recognised as self-destructive. The solution, arrived at through negotiations brokered by the Dutch government, specifically by Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the leading statesman of the young Dutch Republic, was to merge the competing companies into a single entity with a government-granted monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. This entity, chartered in 1602, was the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, universally known by its Dutch initials, the VOC. It was, in its legal structure, something genuinely new in the world. A joint stock company in the modern sense, with permanent capital that investors could buy and sell shares in, rather than capital that was raised for a single voyage and then liquidated, and with sovereign powers, the right to wage war, conclude treaties, establish fortifications and govern territory, granted to it by the state as part of its charter. The VOC was, from its very founding, simultaneously a commercial enterprise and an instrument of state policy, and the blurring of these two identities would define its entire history and the history of the company that the English founded to compete with it. The English East India Company had in fact been chartered slightly earlier, in December 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, in the final years of her reign, as a direct response to the same Dutch competitive pressure and the same loss of access to Lisbon that had driven the Dutch expeditions. The English company's initial structure was less ambitious than what the VOC would become. Its early voyages were organised on a basis closer to the old model of separate terminable joint stock ventures for individual voyages, with permanent joint stock capital not becoming standard until later in the 17th century. But its royal charter granted it, similarly, a monopoly on English trade with Asia, and the implicit understanding that it would need to defend that trade by whatever means were necessary, including military force, in a part of the world where England's government had neither the resources nor, in the early 17th century, the inclination to project power directly. Before we follow these companies into the Spice Islands, it's worth pausing on what, exactly, a joint stock company chartered with sovereign powers actually was, because the legal and organisational form itself is one of the most consequential inventions in this entire story, arguably more consequential in the long run than any individual battle or massacre, because it is the form, more than any specific decision made within it, that made everything else possible. A joint stock company, in the form that the VOC and the English East India Company pioneered, was an organisation in which capital was raised by selling shares to investors, who became part owners of the enterprise in proportion to their investment, who could buy and sell those shares to others without the company itself being dissolved or reconstituted, and who elected, through some form of shareholder assembly, a board of directors who managed the company's affairs on the shareholders' behalf. This sounds, to modern ears, like the most ordinary thing in the world. It is, after all, how the modern corporation works, and the modern corporation is so ubiquitous that its specific historical novelty is easy to forget. But in 1600, the idea of a permanent pool of capital, owned by a continuously changing population of investors, managed by directors who were themselves investors, but who were also professional managers accountable to the broader shareholder body, was new. and the application of this structure to an enterprise that also possessed the legal right to wage war, annex territory, and govern populations was something that no state had previously attempted on this scale. The shareholders of the English East India Company were, for most of its history, a relatively small and socially significant group. London merchants, members of the aristocracy and gentry who had capital to invest, and, increasingly over the 18th century, individuals whose own wealth derived from the company's operations in India and who reinvested portions of it in company stock, creating a self-reinforcing relationship between the company's Indian activities and the structure of its ownership at home. The Court of Directors, elected by the shareholders and based at East India House on Leadenhall Street in London, set policy, appointed senior officials and, at least in principle, exercised oversight over operations that were, in practice, conducted by men thousands of miles away, with communication times measured in months, which meant that the actual exercise of power on the ground in India was, for most practical purposes, in the hands of the company's servants in India themselves, constrained by instructions from London that were often months out of date by the time they arrived, and that left enormous latitude for local initiative, latitude that men like Clive used to transform the entire nature of the enterprise before London had any opportunity to weigh in on whether that transformation was desired. This structural reality, a board of directors in London, nominally in charge, but separated by half a year's communication delay from the actual decisions being made on the ground by company servants whose personal financial incentives often diverge sharply from the company's collective interest, is essential to understanding how the company's transformation from trading concern to territorial sovereign occurred without ever being, at any single point, a deliberate corporate decision made by anyone with the formal authority to make it. Clive did not ask London's permission before engineering the overthrow of Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He could not have, even if he had wanted to. The round trip for such a question would have taken the better part of a year, by which time the situation that prompted the question would have changed entirely. The company's directors in London were, in a very real sense, perpetually ratifying decisions that had already been made and could not be unmade, by employees whose interests in making those decisions were often deeply personal and whose accounts of what they had done and why were naturally calculated to present those decisions in the most favourable possible light. The early decades of both companies were dominated by the spice trade of the Indonesian archipelago, and it was here that the VOC in particular established the pattern of behaviour that would characterise Dutch colonial enterprise in Asia for the following 2 centuries, a pattern that combined commercial sophistication with a willingness to use violence against both European competitors and Asian populations that was, even by the standards of an era not noted for its gentleness, exceptional. The VOC's approach to the spice trade was to attempt actual monopoly control of production, not merely of the trade routes, an ambition that went beyond what the Portuguese had attempted and that required, in the specific geography of the Spice Islands, something close to the complete subjugation of the populations who lived there. The Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg and mace, were the site of the most extreme expression of this policy. In 1621, under the direction of the VOC's Governor-General Jan Pieter Soen Cohen, a man whose name remains to this day one of the most controversial in Dutch colonial history, commemorated by some as a founder of Dutch overseas power and condemned by others as the perpetrator of one of the first systematic genocides of the colonial era. The VOC conducted a campaign against the Bandanese population that resulted in the death, through killing, starvation and enslavement, of the great majority of the island's inhabitants, estimated at somewhere between 13 and 15,000 people out of a pre-conquest population of perhaps 15,000. The survivors were enslaved or deported, and the islands were repopulated with VOC-controlled plantations worked by enslaved labourers brought from elsewhere in the archipelago, producing nutmeg under conditions of total Dutch control that eliminated the possibility of any competing buyer ever again purchasing Bandanese nutmeg from anyone but the VOC. This was monopoly pursued to its logical and horrifying conclusion, not merely controlling the trade in a commodity, but eliminating the independent existence of the society that had previously produced it, on the grounds that any independent producer was a potential seller to a competitor. The Banda massacre was not an aberration in VOC policy. It was the clearest and most extreme expression of a policy that the company pursued with varying degrees of violence across the spice-producing regions it came to control. The VOC's monopoly over cloves was secured through similar, if somewhat less total, measures in the islands of Ambon and the surrounding Maluku archipelago, involving the destruction of clove trees outside VOC-controlled areas, the forced relocation of populations and recurring military campaigns against communities that resisted the company's attempt to dictate what they could grow and to whom they could sell it. The Amboina massacre of 1623, not to be confused with the broader VOC campaigns in the Ambon region, though related to them, was the specific incident that effectively ended English participation in the spice trade of the Indonesian archipelago and redirected the English East India Company's ambitions toward India, with consequences that would prove in the long run considerably more significant for world history than anything that happened in the Spice Islands. The English company maintained a small trading post on the island of Ambon, alongside the much larger Dutch presence, under an agreement that was supposed to allow both companies to trade in the region. In 1623, the VOC's local authorities arrested a group of English merchants and Japanese mercenaries in their service, accused them of conspiring to seize the main Dutch fortress, extracted confessions through torture. The specific techniques described in surviving accounts include water torture of a kind that would be recognisable to anyone familiar with later interrogation controversies, and executed 10 of the Englishmen along with several Japanese and one Portuguese man. The English government's response was furious, and the incident became a long-running diplomatic grievance between England and the Dutch Republic, invoked for decades afterward in pamphlets and parliamentary debates as evidence of Dutch perfidy and cruelty. Whether the conspiracy the Dutch claimed to have uncovered was real, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated remains disputed. The confessions were extracted under torture, which makes their evidentiary value highly questionable by any standard, including the standards of the 17th century, where coerced confessions were nonetheless often treated as legally sufficient. What is not disputed is the practical effect. The English East India Company, having concluded that it could not compete with the VOC's willingness to use force in the Spice Islands, progressively withdrew from the archipelago over the following years and decades, redirecting its limited capital and attention toward the Indian subcontinent, where the VOC's presence, while real, was less totally dominant, and where a different kind of opportunity, one involving textiles rather than spices, and one that would eventually prove far more transformative, was beginning to present itself. India in the early 17th century was not, from the perspective of a small group of European trading companies, an obvious target for conquest, and for the first century and more of European trading activity on the subcontinent, conquest was not remotely on anyone's mind. India was dominated by the Mughal Empire, one of the largest, wealthiest and most sophisticated states on earth, an empire whose population, agricultural output and manufacturing capacity, particularly in textiles, dwarfed anything in contemporary Europe, and whose emperors, in the early 17th century under Jahangir and then Shah Jahan, presided over a court of legendary splendour, commanded armies that no European power could have hoped to match, and regarded the small groups of European merchants requesting trading privileges with the polite condescension appropriate to minor supplicants from a relatively unimportant part of the world. The English East India Company's early presence in India was established through exactly this kind of supplication. In 1612, and again with greater formality in 1615, English representatives, most famously the ambassador Sir Thomas Roe, who spent several years at the Mughal court, negotiated trading privileges that allowed the company to establish factories, as the fortified trading posts of the period were called, at various points along the Indian coast. These early factories, at Surat on the west coast and later at Madras, Bombay and Calcutta, were modest commercial establishments, garrisoned by small numbers of company soldiers whose function was primarily to guard warehouses and goods against theft and piracy, rather than to project any kind of military power against Indian authorities, who could have swept them away with minimal effort had they chosen to. Before we follow the company's textile trade, it's worth spending a moment on what life was actually like for the men, and they were, in this period, almost exclusively men, who staffed the early factories, because the romance that later attached to the company's history obscures a reality that was, for most of the individuals involved, considerably more grim than glamorous. A young man who joined the East India Company's service in the 17th or early 18th century, typically as a writer, the lowest rank of the company's commercial hierarchy, essentially a clerk, was signing up for a posting that he had a very real chance of not surviving. The tropical diseases of the Indian coast, malaria, dysentery, cholera in later periods, and the general burden of infections that a European immune system, evolved in a different disease environment, was poorly equipped to handle, killed company servants at rates that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard. Estimates for some periods and some postings suggest that a substantial proportion of the young men who arrived in India did not survive their first few years there, and the cemeteries that grew up around the company's factories at Madras, at Calcutta, at Bombay, filled with the graves of men in their 20s, their tombstones recording careers that had barely begun before they ended. The compensation for this risk was the possibility, for those who survived, of wealth that would have been entirely unattainable through any career available to a man of similar social background in Britain. The company's official salaries were modest, but the system, much like the VOC's system that we will discuss, tacitly assumed that its servants would supplement those salaries through private trade, through the various forms of commission and gift that attached to positions involving the negotiation of contracts and the administration of revenue, and for those who rose high enough, through the kind of windfall that Plassey represented for Clive and his associates. A young writer who survived a decade or two in India, navigated the disease environment, avoided the worst excesses of the corruption that could end a career in disgrace, and positioned himself well in the company's increasingly profitable territorial administration, could return to Britain as a nabob, wealthy beyond what his birth would have predicted, in a position to buy a country estate, a seat in Parliament, and a respectability that, in the England of the late 18th century, money could increasingly purchase regardless of its origins. The social world of these company servants in India was its own strange creation, a society of Britons living among, employing, and increasingly ruling over a population whose languages, religions and customs were, for most of these men, almost entirely unfamiliar on arrival, and that they encountered through the specific and distorting lens of commercial and later administrative relationships. Some company servants developed genuine scholarly interest in Indian languages, religions and history. The foundations of the academic discipline that would become known as Orientalism were laid by company servants, and the scholars they patronised, men like William Jones, who identified the relationship between Sanskrit and the European languages that would eventually give rise to the entire field of comparative linguistics. Others maintained a more purely extractive relationship, treating their time in India as a period of exile to be endured for the financial rewards it might eventually produce, with as little genuine engagement with their surroundings as the demands of their work allowed. The relationships between company servants and Indian women were a particularly fraught and historically significant aspect of this social world. In the earlier period of company activity, relationships between British men and Indian women, sometimes formalised, sometimes not, were common and, by the standards of the time, relatively unremarkable, producing a substantial population of mixed-race children, many of whom were acknowledged by their British fathers, and some of whom rose to positions of considerable importance within company society. As the 18th century progressed, and especially after 1857, British attitudes hardened considerably, racial segregation became more rigid, and the earlier pattern of relatively open mixing gave way to the much more separated colonial society. British clubs, British neighbourhoods, a much sharper social and racial line between rulers and ruled, that would characterise the Raj in its better-known 19th and 20th century form. What the company was buying in this early period was access to Indian textiles, the cotton cloth in particular, that Indian weavers produced in a range and quality that no European manufacturer could match, and that was finding an increasingly enthusiastic market in Europe, where printed and painted Indian cottons, generically called calicos after the port of Calicut, were becoming fashionable in ways that would eventually provoke protectionist legislation in England specifically designed to protect domestic wool and silk producers from Indian competition. The trade was, in this period, overwhelmingly one-directional in terms of what Europe could offer in exchange. European manufactured goods held little appeal in Indian markets that were themselves producing manufactured goods of superior quality, which meant that the company's trade was financed largely through the export of silver, bullion that flowed from the Americas through Europe and onward to India in exchange for the textiles, spices and other goods that flowed the other way. This bullion flow was itself a source of periodic controversy in England, where critics of the company argued that exporting precious metal to pay for what were, after all, mere luxury goods was a drain on the nation's wealth, an argument that reflected the mercantilist economic thinking of the period and that the company's defenders had to repeatedly rebut. The 17th century, for both the English company in India and the VOC in its expanding Southeast Asian and South Asian holdings, was a century of slow incremental growth in the scale and sophistication of operations, punctuated by wars with European rivals. The English and Dutch fought each other intermittently as an extension of their European wars throughout the century, and the English company also fought a brief and unsuccessful war against the Mughal Empire itself in the 1680s, an episode known as Child's War after the company's governor Josiah Child, which resulted in a humiliating defeat that demonstrated, in case anyone needed reminding, that the Mughal Empire remained entirely capable of crushing the English company's military pretensions whenever it chose to take them seriously. The lesson of Child's War, that the company's survival in India depended on Mughal forbearance rather than on any capacity to resist Mughal power, was one that the company's leadership absorbed and that shaped its policy for decades afterward. And then, in the early 18th century, the entire calculation changed because the Mughal Empire itself began to come apart. The decline of Mughal central authority after the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 is one of the pivotal events in the history of South Asia, and its causes have been debated by historians for generations. Overextension, the fiscal strain of Aurangzeb's long wars, the alienation of Hindu elites by Aurangzeb's religious policies, the simple difficulty of holding together an empire of the Mughal scale once the personal authority of an exceptionally capable emperor was removed. Whatever the precise causes, the effect was a progressive fragmentation of effective political power across the subcontinent. The Mughal emperors continued, for more than a century after Aurangzeb's death, to occupy the throne in Delhi and to be acknowledged, at least nominally, as the supreme source of legitimate authority, but the actual exercise of power increasingly devolved to regional governors, nominally Mughal officials called Nawabs or Nizams, who maintained the forms of Mughal allegiance while in practice running their territories as independent or quasi-independent states, raising their own revenues, maintaining their own armies, and conducting their own diplomacy, including with the various European trading companies whose coastal factories now found themselves dealing with a political landscape that was fragmenting into dozens of competing power centres. The military forces that these companies maintained could, in this fragmented landscape, become meaningful actors in regional politics in a way that had been impossible before. But to understand what these forces actually were, and how a trading company came to possess a military establishment that would eventually be larger than the British Army itself, requires some attention to the specific institution that made it possible, the Sepoy Army. The word sepoy derives from the Persian and Urdu sipahi, meaning soldier, and it referred to Indian soldiers recruited, trained and equipped by the European companies along European lines, drilled in European infantry tactics, armed with European pattern muskets and artillery, organised into regiments commanded by European officers but staffed in their lower ranks entirely by Indians. The Sepoy Army was, from the company's perspective, an extraordinarily efficient solution to a fundamental problem. European soldiers were expensive to recruit, expensive to transport to India, and died of tropical disease at rates that made maintaining a large European garrison prohibitively costly. Indian soldiers, recruited locally, were cheaper, more numerous, often better adapted to the climate, and, crucially, could be recruited from populations that had long martial traditions of their own, particularly from regions like Awadh and Bihar that had supplied soldiers to Indian states for centuries, and that found company service, with its comparatively reliable pay, an attractive alternative to service with the increasingly unstable regional powers of the post-Mughal period. By the early 19th century, the company's army, combining its three regional armies, based at Bengal, Madras and Bombay, each maintained somewhat separately with its own traditions and command structures, numbered in the hundreds of thousands of men, the overwhelming majority of them sepoys, making it one of the largest standing armies anywhere in the world, larger than the armies of most European states, maintained not by a government in the conventional sense, but by a commercial corporation whose shareholders expected this army, among its other functions, to generate a return on investment. The scale of this force is difficult to overstate. At various points in the early 19th century, the company's army was larger than the entire British Army, and its existence meant that the company possessed, in effect, an instrument of military force that dwarfed what the British state itself could deploy without separate parliamentary authorisation and funding, a private army, in the most literal sense, of a size that no private actor in the history of the world had ever previously possessed. The relationship between the sepoy soldiers and their British officers was one of the most consequential and, in the end, one of the most fragile aspects of the entire company system. Sepoy regiments developed their own traditions, their own systems of honour and grievance, their own relationships often strained, with the British command structure over questions of pay, promotion, religious accommodation and the terms of service, particularly regarding deployment overseas, which raised religious objections for soldiers whose caste or religious practices made crossing the sea, or Kala Pani, the Black Water, a matter of serious spiritual concern. The company's army had experienced mutinies before 1857, localised, generally suppressed without becoming the kind of general conflagration that 1857 would become. But each of these earlier episodes was a warning sign of tensions within the Sepoy army that the company's leadership, by and large, did not take as seriously as the events of 1857 would eventually demonstrate they should have. This fragmentation created, for the first time, conditions in which the military forces that the European companies maintained, forces that had been entirely inadequate to challenge Mughal power at its height, but that were nonetheless more disciplined, better drilled, and increasingly better armed than many of the forces available to the regional successor states, could become meaningful actors in regional politics. A company that could field even a few thousand well-drilled soldiers with modern artillery could tip the balance in a succession dispute between rival claimants to a nawab's throne. And a company that tipped such a balance could expect, in return, trading privileges, territorial concessions, and the kind of preferential treatment that translated directly into profit. The companies did not initially set out to conquer India. They set out to profit from India's political fragmentation by selling military assistance to the highest bidder among India's own competing power centres, and discovered in the process that the profits available from this kind of political intervention dwarfed anything available from the textile trade that had been their original business. Before we turn to Bengal specifically, it's worth situating the English and Dutch companies within the broader landscape of European trading companies that operated, with varying degrees of success, in Asia during this period, because the eventual dominance of the English company in India was not predetermined, and for much of the 18th century it was genuinely unclear which European power, if any, would emerge as the dominant force on the subcontinent. The French East India Company, the Compagnie Française des Indes Orientales, established in its more lasting form in 1664 under the direction of Louis XIV's great minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, was, for much of the first half of the 18th century, a genuine rival to the English company for influence in India, with its own network of fortified factories, most importantly at Pondicherry on the southeastern coast, and its own policy, under capable governors like Joseph-François Dupleix, of intervening in the political affairs of Indian states in pursuit of trading advantages, essentially pursuing the same strategy that Clive would later pursue for the English, but pursuing it first and for a period in the 1740s and early 1750s with considerable success. The series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars, fought in southeastern India in the 1740s and 1750s as an extension of the broader Anglo-French rivalry that was also being fought in Europe and North America during the same period, were the proving ground for many of the military techniques and the political strategies, the use of sepoy troops, the manipulation of succession disputes, the granting of trading privileges in exchange for military assistance, that both companies would deploy on a larger scale in the following decades. The eventual English victory in these conflicts, confirmed by the broader British victory over France in the 7 Years' War that concluded in 1763, removed the French company as a serious territorial competitor in India, though the French retained a small enclave at Pondicherry that would remain under French control in one form or another until 1954. A curious historical footnote: a tiny piece of French India persisting into the era of Indian independence and the early Cold War. The Portuguese, who had been the first European power in the Indian Ocean, and whose Estado de India had once dominated the spice trade, had by the 18th century been reduced to a handful of small coastal enclaves, Goa, Daman and Diu on India's west coast being the most significant, that survived not through any continued Portuguese strength, but through the relative indifference of the larger powers, for whom these small Portuguese territories represented no significant threat or opportunity worth the trouble of seizing. Goa, in particular, retained a distinctive Indo-Portuguese culture, Catholic churches in the Portuguese Baroque style, a Konkani Portuguese Creole language, architectural and culinary traditions that blended Portuguese and Indian elements, that survived as a kind of living fossil of the earliest phase of European presence in Asia, remaining under Portuguese rule until 1961, when India annexed the territory by military force, 14 years after independence from Britain. Smaller still were the Danish and Swedish East India companies, each chartered in imitation of the larger Dutch and English models, each maintaining small trading establishments, the Danish at Tranquebar on India's southeastern coast, and later at Serampore near Calcutta, the Swedish primarily in trade with China. That never achieved anything like the scale of their larger competitors, but that nonetheless persisted for considerable periods, generating modest profits from niche positions in the broader Asian trade. The Danish settlement at Serampore would later become significant for an entirely different reason. In the early 19th century, when the English company's territories were closed to Christian missionary activity that the company's directors regarded as commercially disruptive, the Danish enclave at Serampore, just a few miles from Calcutta but outside English company jurisdiction, became the base for one of the most influential Protestant missionary enterprises in the history of British India, led by William Carey, whose translations of Christian scripture into Indian languages and whose broader scholarly work on Indian languages had consequences for Indian education and print culture that extended well beyond their religious purpose. Bengal, the rich agricultural and textile-producing region of northeastern India, centred on the great river delta of the Ganges and Brahmaputra and one of the wealthiest provinces of the old Mughal Empire, became the specific theatre in which this transformation played out most dramatically, and the specific individual most associated with it was a company employee named Robert Clive, whose career is one of the most extraordinary and most morally troubling in the entire history of European colonialism. Clive had arrived in India in 1744 as a teenage clerk in the company's service, a young man from an undistinguished gentry family in Shropshire, whose prospects in England had been limited, and who had taken the company post as one of the few available routes to advancement for a young man of his background. The wars between the English and French companies that broke out as an extension of European conflicts in the 1740s gave Clive an opportunity to demonstrate a talent for military leadership that no one, including apparently Clive himself, had previously suspected he possessed, and by the early 1750s he'd established a reputation as the company's most capable military commander in India, a reputation built on a series of engagements in which Clive, consistently outnumbered, used speed, deception, and a willingness to take risks that more conventional commanders avoided to win victories that seemed, to contemporaries, almost impossibly fortunate. The events that made Clive's reputation permanent, and that set in motion the transformation of the East India Company from a trading concern with some military capacity into the territorial ruler of one of the wealthiest regions on earth, began in 1756, when the young Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who had recently succeeded to his position and who regarded the growing fortifications and growing arrogance of the European trading companies in his territory as an intolerable challenge to his authority, attacked and captured the company's settlement at Calcutta. The capture of Calcutta was followed by an incident, the so-called Black Hole of Calcutta, in which a number of British prisoners were held overnight in a small, poorly ventilated room, and a significant proportion of them died of suffocation and heat, that became, in British accounts, a symbol of Indian barbarity and a justification for the retaliation that followed, though the scale of the incident and the degree to which it represented deliberate cruelty versus simple administrative incompetence on the part of the Nawab's officers has been a subject of considerable historical dispute, with some historians regarding the British accounts as significantly exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Clive was dispatched from Madras with a relief force, retook Calcutta, and then, rather than simply restoring the previous situation, proceeded to engineer the replacement of Siraj-ud-Dowlah with a rival claimant to the Nawabship, Mir Jafar, who had been persuaded, through a combination of promises of power and very substantial bribes, to betray his nominal sovereign at the moment of battle. The Battle of Plassey, fought on June 23, 1757, was, in purely military terms, a relatively minor engagement. Clive's force of roughly 3,000 men, including both European and Indian troops, faced a nominally vastly larger army under Siraj-ud-Dowlah, but the bulk of that larger army, under the command of Mir Jafar and other conspirators who'd been bought, simply did not fight. The battle was decided less by combat than by the prearranged treachery that Clive's agents had spent weeks negotiating, and Siraj-ud-Dowlah's forces collapsed and fled, with the Nawab himself captured and executed shortly afterward. The consequences of Plassey were out of all proportion to the scale of the fighting. Mir Jafar, installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, was now a ruler whose position depended entirely on the company's continued support, and who understood, with the clarity of a man whose predecessor had just been overthrown by exactly this kind of arrangement, that the price of that support would be whatever the company demanded. The company demanded a great deal. The treasury of Bengal was, in the aftermath of Plassey, transferred to company hands on a scale that has been described, with only slight exaggeration, as the looting of an entire kingdom's accumulated wealth. Payments to the company itself, to its army, and to its senior officials, with Clive personally receiving a fortune that made him, almost overnight, one of the wealthiest individuals in Britain, a fortune whose scale and the manner of its acquisition would become, in subsequent decades, the subject of parliamentary inquiry and a national scandal. The transition from the plunder of Plassey to the systematic territorial administration that would define the company's rule for the following century took a further decisive step in 1765, when Clive, back in India for a second term as the company's governor, after a period in Britain spent partly defending his conduct and partly enjoying his fortune, negotiated with the Mughal emperor Shah Alam II, an arrangement known as the Diwani. The emperor, whose own authority by this point extended little beyond the immediate vicinity of Delhi, and who depended on whatever allies he could find for his continued survival, granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, the right to collect and administer the revenue of these provinces, one of the most fundamental functions of sovereign government in the Mughal system, and one that generated, in Bengal alone, revenues that exceeded the entire annual revenue of the British government's domestic budget. The significance of the Diwani grant cannot be overstated, and contemporaries on all sides understood its significance, even if they understood it in different ways. From the perspective of the Mughal emperor, the grant was a face-saving fiction. The company would now formally hold, as the emperor's delegated revenue collector, an authority that it had already been exercising in practice since Plassey, and the emperor would receive in exchange an annual tribute that was a fraction of what the revenue actually generated, but that was nonetheless useful to a ruler whose other sources of income had largely evaporated. From the perspective of the company's leadership, the Diwani transformed the organization's fundamental nature. A trading company that collected the land revenue of tens of millions of people was no longer, in any meaningful sense, primarily a trading company. It was a government, an unelected, unaccountable, profit-seeking government, whose shareholders in London expected dividends, and whose officials in Bengal now had access to a revenue stream that dwarfed anything the spice or textile trade had ever generated, and that could be used, among other things, to purchase the very goods that the company traded in Europe, effectively allowing the company to buy Indian textiles and other exports using Indian tax revenue rather than the bullion that had previously been required, a transformation in the economics of the trade that historians have identified as one of the mechanisms through which wealth was transferred from India to Britain on a truly massive scale over the following decades. The human cost of this transformation in its early years was catastrophic, and the most dramatic single demonstration of that cost was the Bengal famine of 1770. But the famine, devastating as it was an acute crisis layered onto a more gradual and in some ways equally consequential transformation of Bengal's economy. The systematic dismantling of what had been, before the company's arrival, one of the most sophisticated textile manufacturing regions in the world. Bengal's weavers had, for centuries before the company's arrival, produced cotton and silk textiles of a quality, and in a quantity that made the region one of the great manufacturing centres of the pre-industrial world. The fine muslins of Dhaka, in particular, were renowned across Asia, and, increasingly through the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, for a quality of weave so fine that contemporary European observers struggled to believe it had been produced without mechanical assistance, describing fabric so light and so finely woven that an entire garment could supposedly be passed through a ring. This textile industry was organised through networks of independent weavers, master craftsmen, and merchants who coordinated production and distribution across a dense web of relationships that had evolved over centuries and that represented in their own way as sophisticated a productive system as anything in contemporary Europe, even if it lacked the mechanisation that European manufacturing would soon begin to acquire. The company's acquisition of the Diwani and the political dominance over Bengal that it represented gave company officials and the merchants operating under company protection an increasingly coercive position in relation to this textile economy. Weavers who had previously sold their goods to whichever merchant offered the best price found themselves, with growing frequency, compelled to sell to company agents at prices the agents themselves dictated, under contracts enforced through a legal and administrative system that the company itself controlled, a position that no merchant, however powerful, had occupied in Bengal's textile trade, before the company became, simultaneously, a major purchaser of textiles and the government with the power to enforce the terms on which textiles were purchased. This combination of commercial and governmental power in the same hands, applied to an industry on which millions of Bengali livelihoods depended, was a novel and devastating concentration of leverage. The longer-term transformation came with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and specifically with the mechanisation of cotton spinning and weaving that began in the late 18th century and accelerated dramatically in the early 19th. British-manufactured cotton cloth, produced in the new factories of Lancashire using raw cotton increasingly supplied from India itself, could be produced at costs that handloom weavers, however skilled, could not match. The company's territorial control of India meant that British-manufactured cloth could be imported into India with minimal tariff barriers, while Indian cloth exported to Britain faced the kind of protective duties that British textile manufacturers, with their political influence in Parliament, ensured remained in place. The result, over the first half of the 19th century, was a wholesale reversal of what had been, for centuries, the direction of the textile trade between Britain and India. A region that had once exported high-quality finished cloth to Britain became, instead, an exporter of raw cotton and an importer of British-manufactured cloth, with consequences for the weavers of Bengal and other textile-producing regions that amounted to the destruction of their livelihoods on a scale that some economic historians have described, not without controversy but not without justification either, as a process of deliberate deindustrialization, the dismantling of one of the world's most sophisticated manufacturing economies in order to create a market for the products of another. The Governor-General William Bentinck, writing in the 1830s, described the consequences in terms that have been quoted by generations of historians as a summary of what had occurred. The bones of the cotton weavers, he wrote, were bleaching the plains of India. Whether or not Bentinck's specific language was hyperbolic, the broader pattern it described, a textile workforce that had once numbered in the millions, reduced to a fraction of its former scale, with the cities that had depended on textile production, Dhaka most dramatically, undergoing population declines that contemporary observers compared to the aftermath of plague, was real, and it represents one of the clearest cases in the entire history of European colonialism of an industrial economy being deliberately and successfully outcompeted through the asymmetric application of political power. Returning to the acute crisis of 1770 itself, the exact causes of the famine were complex, A failure of the monsoon was the proximate trigger, and famines caused by monsoon failure were not new to Bengal or to India more broadly. But the scale of the 1770 famine, in which contemporary estimates suggested that as much as a third of the population of Bengal, perhaps 10 million people, died, was widely attributed, both at the time and by subsequent historians, to the specific policies of the company's administration, the maintenance, and in some accounts the increase, of revenue demands even as the harvest failed. The absence of the kind of famine relief mechanisms that even the often criticised late Mughal administration had maintained, and a general indifference on the part of an administration whose primary metric of success was the revenue it remitted to London, and for which the deaths of millions of the people who generated that revenue registered, if at all, primarily as a problem for future revenue collection, rather than as a humanitarian catastrophe in its own right. The Bengal famine of 1770 became, almost immediately, one of the central pieces of evidence in the growing body of criticism of the company's conduct in India, criticism that would, over the following decades, force a fundamental reassessment in Britain of what exactly this corporation was and what relationship it ought to have to the British state. The scandal of the company's conduct in Bengal generated not only parliamentary investigations, but a body of intellectual criticism that is worth examining, because the East India Company became, for the political economists and philosophers of the late 18th century, one of the central case studies through which they worked out ideas about monopoly, governance, and the proper relationship between commerce and the state, ideas that would shape economic and political thought for generations afterward. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, and not coincidentally, since both documents emerge from the same broad currents of 18th century thought about commerce, liberty, and legitimate authority, devoted considerable attention to the East India Company as an example of everything that he believed was wrong with the mercantilist system of state-chartered monopolies. Smith's argument was not that trade with India was undesirable, but that a trading monopoly, especially one that had also acquired the powers of government, created a fundamental conflict of interest. A company whose profits depended on its monopoly privileges, rather than on genuine commercial efficiency, had every incentive to use its governmental powers to entrench and exploit that monopoly, rather than to govern in the interests of the population it governed. The company's shareholders wanted dividends. The company's Indian subjects needed government. These two objectives were not the same, and Smith argued, with the famous clarity that makes The Wealth of Nations still readable and still influential, nearly 2.5 centuries later, that no amount of good intentions on the part of individual company officials could resolve a structural conflict that was built into the very nature of the organisation. Edmund Burke's speeches during the Hastings impeachment, which we have already mentioned, went further than Smith's relatively abstract economic critique, into a register of moral and constitutional argument that remains genuinely powerful to read today. Burke argued that the company's conduct in India represented a kind of geographical morality, the idea, which he attributed to the company's defenders, that actions which would be considered crimes if committed in England became, somehow, acceptable when committed at a sufficient distance, against people of a different religion and culture under the cover of commercial necessity. Burke rejected this distinction entirely, arguing that the principles of justice were not geographically variable, that an Englishman in Bengal was bound by the same moral law as an Englishman in London, and that the specific horror of the company's conduct was precisely that it had been conducted by men who would never have dreamed of behaving in such a way at home, and who had convinced themselves, through the moral distancing that empire made possible, that distance itself was a kind of moral solvent. These critiques did not, in the end, result in the dismantling of British rule in India. If anything, the trajectory of the following century moved toward more, not less, direct British governmental involvement, culminating in the Crown rule established after 1857. But the intellectual framework that Smith, Burke, and their contemporaries developed, the recognition that commercial monopoly and governmental authority were dangerous in combination, that distance did not exempt conduct from moral scrutiny, that the language of trade could conceal arrangements that, examined honestly, were simply systems of extraction, became part of the permanent vocabulary through which the conduct of empires, corporations, and the relationship between the two would be discussed and criticised for the following 2 centuries, including in contexts that Smith and Burke could never have anticipated, and that extend, in various forms, into debates about corporate power and global economic relationships that continue today. The scandal of the company's conduct in Bengal, the famine, the scale of the fortunes that men like Clive had brought home, the visible spectacle of newly wealthy returnees, derisively called nabobs, buying their way into English political and social life with money whose origins everyone understood and few were willing to examine too closely, produced, over the final decades of the 18th century, a series of parliamentary interventions that progressively eroded the company's independence and brought it under increasing degrees of government oversight, even as its territorial possessions in India continued to expand. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the first major intervention, establishing a degree of parliamentary supervision over the company's affairs and creating the position of Governor-General of Bengal, with the first holder of that office, Warren Hastings, becoming one of the most consequential and most controversial figures in the entire history of British India. Hastings was, in many respects, the opposite of Clive in temperament, a serious scholar of Indian languages and culture, a man who genuinely believed that British rule in India ought to be conducted, as far as possible, according to Indian legal and administrative traditions, rather than simply imposed wholesale from outside, and a capable administrator who did more than perhaps any other single individual to systematise the chaotic structure that the company's improvised expansion had created. Hastings was also a man who governed in an environment of continuous warfare and continuous financial crisis, and whose methods for managing both, including the extraction of funds from Indian rulers through means that range from the legally questionable to the straightforwardly coercive, became, after his return to England, the subject of an impeachment trial that ran, with interruptions, from 1788 to 1795, the longest such proceeding in British parliamentary history. The impeachment, led by figures including Edmund Burke, one of the most eloquent critics of the company's conduct in India, and a man whose speeches against Hastings remain to this day remarkable documents of moral outrage against the abuse of corporate and colonial power, ended in Hastings' acquittal on every charge. But the trial itself, regardless of its verdict, represented something significant, a recognition by the British political establishment that the conduct of the company in India was a matter of legitimate public concern, that the actions of company officials thousands of miles away could be subjected to the scrutiny of British law and British public opinion, and that the fiction of the company as a purely private commercial enterprise, accountable only to its shareholders, was no longer sustainable. Pitt's India Act of 1784 went further, establishing a board of control in London with authority over the company's political and military decisions, even as the company retained its commercial privileges and its day-to-day administration of Indian territory. This dual structure, a private company conducting the actual government of vast Indian territories under the supervisory but not directly operational authority of a British government department, was the framework within which the final and most dramatic phase of the company's territorial expansion took place through the early decades of the 19th century under governors-general whose names, Wellesley, Hastings the Younger, not to be confused with Warren, Dalhousie, preside over a period in which the company's territorial holdings expanded through a combination of war, annexation, and the absorption of supposedly independent princely states, whose rulers died without what the company's lawyers determined to be a legitimate heir, to cover almost the entire subcontinent. While the English company was undergoing this transformation from trading concern to territorial empire, its great Dutch rival was experiencing a very different trajectory, one that ended not in the kind of gradual absorption into state structures that the English company underwent, but in outright bankruptcy and dissolution. Before tracing the VOC's decline, it is worth dwelling on what its operations actually looked like at their height, because the sheer logistical achievement of the VOC's trading network, even setting aside the violence through which much of that network was established and maintained, represented one of the most sophisticated commercial operations the world had yet seen. The VOC's basic business model depended on the annual fleets that sailed between the Netherlands and Asia, the outbound fleets carrying silver, European manufactured goods, and the personnel needed to staff the company's Asian operations, the homebound fleets carrying the spices, textiles, porcelain, and other Asian goods that constituted the company's primary source of profit. The voyage itself, around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean, took the better part of a year each way, and the mortality on these voyages, from scurvy in the days before its prevention was properly understood, from the various diseases that spread through crowded ships, from the simple dangers of sailing vessels on long oceanic passages, was severe enough that the VOC's personnel requirements created a continuous demand for new recruits from across the Netherlands and increasingly from other parts of Northern Europe, with German and Scandinavian recruits forming a substantial proportion of the company's workforce by the 18th century. The intra-Asian trade, the trade conducted between Asian ports, as distinct from the trade between Asia and Europe, was, for much of the VOC's history, at least as profitable as the Europe-Asia trade, and arguably more central to the company's actual operations. The VOC purchased textiles in India to trade for spices in Indonesia, purchased Japanese silver and copper to trade in China and Southeast Asia, purchased Persian goods to trade elsewhere in the Indian Ocean world, operating in effect as a vast interconnected trading network whose profits derived as much from arbitrage between Asian markets as from the more famous trade in spices destined for European consumption. This intra-Asian trade required the VOC to maintain trading posts and personnel across an enormous geographic range, from Persia to Japan, from the Cape of Good Hope to the eastern reaches of the Indonesian archipelago, and the coordination of this network, using only the communication technologies available in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a logistical achievement of genuine sophistication, even if the purposes it served were, as we have seen, often achieved through methods of considerable brutality. Batavia itself, as the administrative hub of this network, developed a social structure that reflected its function. The Dutch population of Batavia was always relatively small. The VOC never attempted anything like mass settlement of its Asian territories by Dutch colonists, preferring instead to maintain a relatively small administrative and commercial class supported by a much larger population of enslaved labourers, indentured workers, and free Asian residents, particularly the Chinese merchant community, whose commercial networks the VOC depended on for access to markets and goods that the company's own personnel could not easily reach. This Chinese community occupied an ambiguous position, economically essential to the VOC's operations, but also viewed with suspicion and periodically subjected to violent persecution, most catastrophically in the 1740 massacre, in which the VOC authorities, responding to fears of a Chinese uprising that may have been largely imaginary, oversaw or permitted the killing of thousands of Chinese residents of Batavia, an event that even by the standards of VOC violence stands out for its scale and its target, a community whose economic cooperation the company had depended on for over a century. killed in a paroxysm of colonial paranoia that the VOC's own subsequent inquiries struggle to fully explain or justify. The VOC had reached its peak of wealth and territorial extent in the 17th century, controlling not only the spice-producing islands of the Maluku archipelago, but a network of fortified trading posts and territorial possessions that extended from the Cape of Good Hope, where the VOC established a colony that would become the foundation of what is now South Africa, to Japan, where the VOC maintained the only European trading presence permitted during Japan's long period of restricted foreign contact, operating from the small artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbour. The VOC's headquarters in Asia, the city of Batavia, built on the ruins of the Javanese port of Jayakarta, which VOC forces had destroyed in 1619, became one of the great cities of the colonial world, a fortified Dutch settlement whose canals and architecture were deliberately designed to evoke Amsterdam, populated by a complex multi-ethnic society of Dutch officials, mixed-race families, enslaved labourers brought from across the Indian Ocean world, and Chinese merchants whose commercial networks the VOC depended on, even as it periodically subjected the Chinese population of Batavia to violent persecution, most notoriously in a massacre in 1740 that killed thousands. The VOC's decline, which became increasingly evident over the course of the 18th century and culminated in the company's formal dissolution in 1799, has been attributed by historians to a combination of factors that, taken together, paint a picture of an organisation whose fundamental structure had not adapted to changing circumstances. The company's profits had always depended heavily on monopoly control of specific high-value commodities: pepper, cloves, nutmeg. But the value of these commodities, relative to the overall expansion of global trade, declined over the 18th century, even as the cost of maintaining the VOC's vast network of fortifications, garrisons, and administrative personnel across Asia continued to grow. The company's administrative and military establishment in Asia became, over time, a machine for generating costs that the trade in spices increasingly could not cover, and the company increasingly financed its operations through borrowing rather than through trading profits. A pattern of deficit financing that by the final decades of the 18th century had produced a debt burden that the company's revenues had no realistic prospect of servicing. The corruption of the VOC's officials in Asia was legendary, even by the generous standards that the period applied to colonial administration. The practice of officials using their positions to conduct private trade, in violation of the company's monopoly, but with the tacit acceptance of a system in which official salaries were deliberately kept low on the assumption that officials would supplement their income through exactly this kind of private enterprise, meant that much of the wealth the VOC's Asian operations generated never reached the company's accounts at all, flowing instead into the private fortunes of officials who, like the English company's nabobs, returned to the Netherlands with riches whose origins were an open secret. The final crisis came with the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War of 1780 to 1784, in which the Royal Navy's superiority over the Dutch fleet resulted in the loss or disruption of much of the VOC's shipping and trade, compounding the company's existing financial difficulties to the point where recovery became impossible. The Dutch Republic itself was, in the final years of the 18th century, undergoing its own political upheaval, with the French revolutionary armies invading in 1795 and establishing a client republic that took over the VOC's debts and, in 1799, formally dissolved the company, transferring its remaining Asian possessions to the Dutch state. The VOC, which at its height had been arguably the most powerful commercial enterprise in the history of the world, ended not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that ended the English company's independence, but with the quiet bureaucratic absorption of a bankrupt organisation into the state that had originally chartered it, a less dramatic ending, but one that reflected in its own way the same fundamental truth that the English company's history would eventually demonstrate, that a corporation exercising sovereign powers over millions of people in territories thousands of miles from its home government was, in the end, an arrangement that could not be sustained indefinitely, regardless of how it had begun. The final chapters of the English East India Company's history were dominated by two developments: its role in the opium trade with China and the catastrophic rebellion of 1857 that between them brought to a close the era of corporate sovereignty in India and transformed the relationship between Britain and Asia in ways whose consequences extend to the present day. The opium trade requires some explanation because it represents one of the more morally indefensible chapters in the company's history, and because it illustrates, with particular clarity, the way in which the company's territorial control of India became an instrument for projects that had nothing to do with India itself. By the late 18th century, the company faced a structural problem in its trade with China. British consumers had developed an enormous appetite for Chinese tea, which the company imported in vast quantities, but Chinese consumers had little interest in anything Britain produced, meaning that tea had to be paid for as Indian textiles had once been paid for, primarily in silver, a drain on British bullion reserves that mercantilist economic thinking regarded with the same alarm that had once attended the silver flows to India. The solution that the company arrived at was opium. Opium poppies could be grown in India, specifically in the territories of Bengal and later Malwa, which the company controlled or influenced, and opium, while illegal to import under Chinese law, found a ready market among Chinese consumers willing to pay silver for it despite the prohibition. The company itself did not directly smuggle opium into China. It maintained the legal fiction of compliance with Chinese law by selling opium at auction in Calcutta to private merchants, who then carried it to China and sold it through the elaborate smuggling networks that had developed along the Chinese coast, with the silver proceeds flowing back to pay for the tea that the company shipped to Britain. This arrangement allowed the company to profit enormously from the opium trade, while maintaining a degree of formal distance from the illegal trafficking itself, a distinction that satisfied the company's lawyers and shareholders, if not, eventually, the Chinese government, whose increasingly desperate attempts to suppress the opium trade and whose seizure and destruction of British-owned opium stocks at Canton in 1839 provided the pretext for the First Opium War, fought between Britain and China from 1839 to 1842, and resulting in a British victory that opened Chinese ports to British trade, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and inaugurated what Chinese historiography still refers to as the beginning of the century of humiliation. The opium trade that the East India Company had developed as a solution to its tea trade balance of payments problem thus became, directly, the cause of a war whose consequences for China's subsequent history were profound, and whose origins lay in the specific financial logic of a corporation managing its accounts. The rebellion of 1857, called, depending on the political perspective of the person describing it, the Indian Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Indian Independence, was the event that finally and decisively ended the company's century of territorial rule, and its causes were as complex as the century of accumulated grievance that produced it. The immediate trigger was a controversy over rifle cartridges. New cartridges issued to the company's Indian soldiers, the sepoys who formed the overwhelming majority of the company's army, were rumoured to be greased with a mixture that included both beef and pork fat, an abomination to Hindu and Muslim soldiers respectively, whose religious objections to the cartridges became the spark for a mutiny that began among sepoy regiments in May 1857 and spread rapidly across northern India, drawing in not only soldiers but a broad coalition of Indian princes, landholders and populations whose grievances against a century of company rule. Annexations, the disruption of traditional landholding patterns, the dismantling of indigenous industries, the general experience of being governed by an organisation whose ultimate loyalty was to shareholders in London, found in the Sepoy Mutiny an opportunity for a broader uprising against company authority. Before the rebellion suppression, it's worth pausing on what the Mughal court itself had become by 1857, and what its destruction represented culturally as well as politically, because the Mughal Empire, even in its attenuated 19th century form, was not merely a faded political institution, but the custodian of a cultural tradition whose loss in 1857 and its aftermath was experienced by many Indians as a rupture of civilizational significance. Bahadur Shah II, known by his pen name Zafar, was, whatever his limitations as a political actor, a poet of genuine accomplishment, writing in the Urdu literary tradition that had flourished at the Mughal court for generations, and that represented one of the great literary cultures of the Islamic world, a tradition of ghazal poetry, of elaborate courtly etiquette, of music and miniature painting and architecture that, even as the Mughal Empire's political power had withered to almost nothing beyond the walls of the Red Fort in Delhi, continued to make Delhi one of the great centres of culture in the Indian subcontinent. The court that Zafar presided over was poor, politically powerless, and dependent on a company pension for its very survival, but it remained a living link to a cultural tradition that stretched back through centuries of Mughal patronage, and the poets, musicians and scholars who continued to gather at the Red Fort represented the last flowering of a courtly culture that had no real parallel anywhere else in India. The British suppression of the 1857 rebellion included the deliberate destruction of much of this cultural world. Delhi, after its recapture by British forces in September 1857, was subjected to a campaign of looting, destruction and reprisal killing that specifically targeted the symbols and the physical infrastructure of Mughal culture. Palaces were looted and partially demolished. The population of the old city was driven out en masse in a collective punishment that fell on Muslims in particular, regardless of their individual involvement in the rebellion, and the cultural institutions that had sustained Delhi's literary and artistic life for centuries were scattered, their patrons impoverished or dead, their continuity broken in ways that the subsequent decades of British rule did little to restore. Zafar himself, exiled to Rangoon in Burma, died there in 1862, his grave initially unmarked, a final, almost symbolic indignity for the last in a line of emperors that had once ruled more territory and commanded more wealth than any contemporary European monarch. The poet Ghalib, who lived through the rebellion and its aftermath in Delhi, and who is generally regarded as the greatest Urdu poet of the 19th century, wrote in letters to friends of a city he no longer recognised, friends and acquaintances dead or scattered, the cultural and social world that had sustained his entire life and work simply gone, replaced by a British administration that had no interest in and little understanding of what had been destroyed. Ghalib's own poetry survived, and his reputation as one of the great poets of the Urdu language only grew in the decades after his death in 1869. But the world that had produced him, the Mughal Delhi of courtly patronage and literary gathering that stretched back, in an unbroken, if increasingly attenuated line, to the founding of the Mughal Empire more than 3 centuries earlier, did not survive 1857 in any meaningful sense. What came after was something different, still recognisably Indian, still producing extraordinary cultural achievement, but operating within a colonial framework that had no place for the kind of independent courtly patronage that had sustained Mughal culture for so long. The rebellion was suppressed, after more than a year of fighting marked by atrocities on both sides. The massacre of British civilians, including women and children, at Cawnpore became one of the central images in British accounts of the rebellion, just as the brutal reprisals that British forces subsequently visited on Indian populations including mass executions and the deliberate destruction of Delhi's Mughal architectural heritage, became central to Indian accounts. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II, whose court had become, briefly, a symbolic centre for the rebellion, despite his own limited involvement in its planning, was deposed and exiled to Burma, formally ending the Mughal dynasty that had nominally ruled India in however attenuated a form for more than 3 centuries. The British government's response to the rebellion was the Government of India Act of 1858, which transferred the territories and powers that the East India Company had accumulated over 2.5 centuries directly to the British Crown, establishing the period of direct colonial rule that would be known as the British Raj, and that would continue until Indian independence in 1947. The East India Company itself, stripped of its governmental functions, continued to exist in a purely formal sense for a few more years. Its remaining commercial functions wound down, until it was formally dissolved by an Act of Parliament that took effect in 1874, bringing to a close, in a final piece of bureaucratic paperwork that attracted relatively little attention at the time, the existence of an organisation that had, at its height, governed more people than any government in human history had ever governed, and that had done so not as a state, but as a company. One more thread deserves to be followed before we step back to assess the broader meaning of this story, because it connects the East India Company to an entirely different chapter of history that most people do not immediately associate with it, the American Revolution. By the early 1770s, the East India Company found itself, despite its enormous Indian revenues, in genuine financial difficulty. The costs of its territorial expansion and administration in Bengal, combined with mismanagement and the effects of the 1770 famine on the revenue the company could extract, had left it dependent on loans from the British government to remain solvent, loans that came with conditions, including parliamentary oversight of the kind that the Regulating Act of 1773 would formalise. One of the company's problems was a large accumulated surplus of tea that it had been unable to sell profitably in Britain, where high taxes on tea had encouraged a substantial smuggling trade in tea imported illegally from the Netherlands, undercutting the company's legitimate sales. Parliament's solution, embodied in the Tea Act of 1773, was to allow the company to ship tea directly to the American colonies without it first passing through Britain and being subject to the duties that would normally apply there, a measure that paradoxically would have made the company's tea cheaper in the colonies than either smuggled Dutch tea or tea that had paid the full range of British duties, even after the colonial tea duty that the Act left in place was applied. The British government's intent was straightforward: rescue the company from its financial difficulties by giving it a competitive advantage in the lucrative colonial tea market, while also, not incidentally, establishing the principle that Parliament could tax the colonies, and that the colonies would accept company tea on terms that implicitly acknowledged that taxing authority. The American response was not gratitude for cheaper tea. It was outrage at what colonial leaders correctly identified as an attempt to use commercial policy to establish a constitutional principle, the right of a parliament in which the colonies had no representation to impose taxes on colonial trade through the back door of a seemingly unrelated piece of corporate relief legislation. The Boston Tea Party of December 1773, in which a group of colonists boarded East India Company ships in Boston Harbour and threw their cargo of tea into the water, was a protest against the East India Company only in the most immediate and incidental sense. The company was, in this story, essentially an instrument of British parliamentary policy, its tea chosen as the specific target because it was the company's tea that the Tea Act had specifically privileged, and because destroying company property made a point about the relationship between commercial policy and constitutional principle that destroying any other cargo would not have made nearly as effectively. The East India Company's role in the events leading to the American Revolution is, in this sense, a kind of historical footnote to its much larger role in India. but it is a footnote that illustrates, in a different register, the same basic theme that runs through this entire story. The company's affairs were never purely commercial, and decisions made in London to address the company's financial difficulties could have consequences, in this case, consequences for the entire subsequent history of the United States, that had nothing directly to do with trade in spices or textiles or tea itself, and everything to do with the way that a single corporation's finances had become entangled with the constitutional and political questions of an empire that spanned multiple continents. What, in the end, are we to make of the East India Companies, and particularly of the English East India Company, whose transformation from a group of London merchants seeking spices to the sovereign ruler of the Indian subcontinent represents one of the strangest trajectories that any organisation has ever followed? The question matters not merely as a historical curiosity, but because the structures that the company pioneered, the joint stock corporation with permanent capital, the use of private military force in pursuit of commercial objectives, the blurring of the line between commercial and governmental authority, the systematic extraction of wealth from a colonized territory disguised in the language of trade and administration, have echoes in the subsequent history of corporate power that extend well beyond the specific context of 18th and 19th century imperialism. The company's defenders, both at the time and subsequently, have pointed to the genuine achievements of British rule in India, the infrastructure of railways and telegraphs and irrigation systems, the codification of law, the establishment of an administrative and educational system that, whatever its colonial purposes, left institutions that independent India inherited and built upon. These achievements are real, and a fully honest history cannot simply dismiss them. But they coexisted with, and in significant measure were financed by, a system of extraction that transferred wealth from India to Britain on a scale that economic historians continue to debate, but that was, by any reasonable measure, enormous. A transfer that some economic historians have argued was a significant contributing factor to the very development gap between Britain and India that the infrastructure built during this period is sometimes credited with narrowing. The specific human cost, the Bengal famine of 1770, the famines that recurred under company and then crown rule throughout the 19th century, with a regularity that suggests systemic rather than merely accidental causes, the destruction of indigenous textile industries that had been, before the company's arrival, among the most sophisticated manufacturing operations in the world, the violence of conquest and of the suppression of resistance from Plassey through 1857 and beyond. These are not incidental footnotes to a story of trade and administration. They are central to what the company was, and any account of its history that fails to give them the weight they deserve is participating, whether consciously or not, in exactly the kind of selective memory that has shaped how this history has been told and remembered for a century and a half. What's perhaps most striking, looking back from the present, is how unplanned the whole trajectory was. No one in London in 1600, subscribing capital to a new company chartered to trade in pepper, imagined that their investment would eventually fund the conquest of an entire subcontinent. No one at Plassey in 1757 was executing a master plan for the territorial government of India. Clive's objective was the restoration of favourable trading conditions and, not incidentally, his own enrichment, and the territorial consequences that flowed from his victory were, in the most literal sense, unintended, even if they proved, once they had occurred, to be enormously profitable for those positioned to benefit from them. The company became an empire not because anyone set out to build an empire, but because a long sequence of individually rational decisions, defend the factory, support the friendly claimant, collect the revenue that's now available, suppress the rebellion that threatens the revenue, accumulated over decades into an outcome that none of the individual decision-makers had intended, or in most cases even fully understood was happening until it had already happened. The physical traces of the East India Companies are scattered across the world in forms that range from the monumental to the easily overlooked. The headquarters of the English Company, East India House on Leadenhall Street in London, was demolished in the 1860s after the company's dissolution, but the street pattern of the City of London still bears its imprint, and the company's archives, an extraordinary collection of records documenting 2.5 centuries of trade, war and administration, are preserved today in the British Library, available to researchers in a reading room a short walk from where the company's directors once met to set policy for a subcontinent. In India, the legacy is everywhere and impossible to summarise briefly. In the railway network, much of which was built under company and then crown auspices, and which remains, to this day, one of the largest rail systems in the world. In the legal system, whose basic structures derive from the codes established during this period. In the English language itself, which remains, alongside Hindi, one of India's most important languages of administration, education, and inter-regional communication, a direct legacy of the linguistic policies of company and crown rule. In the city of Calcutta, now Kolkata, whose growth from a minor trading factory to one of the largest cities in the world was a direct product of its role as the company's Bengal headquarters. In the very borders of the modern nations of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, whose shapes reflect, in ways that continue to generate conflict, the territorial arrangements that the company and its crown successor established. In Indonesia, the VOC's legacy is similarly pervasive. In the city of Jakarta, built on the foundations of the VOC's Batavia, whose old town still contains Dutch colonial architecture. In the plantation economy that the VOC established for spice production, and that Dutch colonial rule, after the VOC's dissolution, extended to other commodities including coffee and sugar, with consequences for land use and labour relations that shaped Indonesian society well into the 20th century. In the Cape Colony that the VOC founded at the southern tip of Africa, whose history, through Dutch and then British colonial rule, and eventually through the apartheid system that the descendants of Dutch settlers would construct, represents one of the most consequential and most tragic of all the VOC's legacies, arising from what was, in its origins, simply a victualling station, established to resupply ships on the long voyage to and from the Spice Islands. The Banda Islands, where the VOC's monopoly ambitions produced the genocidal campaign of 1621, remain today small, remote, and sparsely populated. Nutmeg still grows there, the descendants of the trees that the VOC's plantations once monopolised, and the island's population today includes descendants of the enslaved labourers the VOC brought to replace the population it had destroyed. The forts the VOC built there still stand, weathered by 4 centuries of tropical climate, visited occasionally by the kind of traveller interested in the specific history of a place that most of the world has never heard of, and that was, for a few terrible years in the 1620s, the focus of one of the most ruthless commercial enterprises the world has ever produced. The night is settling in now, and the long story of the East India Companies has reached its end, or the end of the part that can be told in a single sitting, because the consequences of what these organisations did continue to shape the world in ways that are still being worked out, in the economic relationships between Europe and Asia, in the political boundaries and tensions of South Asia, in the corporate structures that govern so much of the global economy today, and that owe, whether their modern executives realise it or not, something to the precedents that the VOC and the English East India Company established 4 centuries ago. It is a strange thing to consider as you drift towards sleep tonight, that the spices that once justified an entire system of global trade, that drove men to cross oceans and burn islands and enslave populations in pursuit of a commodity that exists today in a small jar in almost every kitchen in the world, available for a few coins at any supermarket, stripped of every trace of the violence and the wealth, and the empires that were once built around its acquisition. The nutmeg in your kitchen, if you have any, grows ultimately from trees whose ancestors were once the most valuable plants on earth, guarded by fortresses, fought over by the great trading companies of two rival nations, the object of a monopoly enforced through the near total destruction of the people who had grown it for centuries before any European had ever heard of it. The ships that once carried these commodities across the world's oceans are gone, broken up or sunk centuries ago. The forts that guarded the Spice Islands are crumbling in the tropical heat. The grand houses that the nabobs and the VOC's wealthy returnees built with the fortunes they brought home are, many of them, still standing. Country houses in the English and Dutch countryside, their owners' portraits still hanging in halls paid for with money whose origins those owners' descendants do not always care to examine closely. The company that once governed more people than any government on earth is a few crates of documents in a library reading room, and a name that occasionally appears with a certain historical irony on a brand of tea or a piece of merchandise that trades on the romance of a history whose realities were considerably less romantic than the branding suggests. Let that settle around you now. The Spice Islands are dark and quiet tonight. The trade winds moving across waters that once carried fleets whose cargoes were worth more than the treasuries of small kingdoms. The rivers of Bengal flow as they have always flowed, past cities whose growth and whose suffering were both, in their different ways, products of a company's ledger books. The world that these companies helped to create, a world of global trade, of corporate power, of economic relationships between continents that persist long after the specific organizations that established them have been dissolved and forgotten, is the world you are living in tonight, whether you knew its origins or not. Rest easy.